Hello everyone, and welcome to Spirit Basics, the show for both the beginner and the avid connoisseur of fine spirits. I'm Jennifer Allan.
And I'm Stephen Olson, and on today's show, we're going to take a closer look at bourbon and the American whiskeys. Now, whiskey itself, unfortunately, we can't take credit for this. Whiskey began in Scotland and Ireland, and originally it was called Uscabeta, which of course is a Gaelic word for water of life, naturally. Now, back in about the 16th century, when the first colonists were coming over, they brought whiskey with them. And they didn't just bring the product, they brought the process as well, the knowledge of how to distill. And looking for grain to use here in the New World, we didn't have a lot of barley, so they turned to wheat, rye, and even corn eventually. The early distillates were made mostly with rye, and the early distillers were people you've probably heard of, like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and so forth. Now, Dale's going to tell you a much bigger part of this story in just a moment, but understand that the first distillers were in western Pennsylvania. That's where the industry began, and the government moved them to Kentucky and Tennessee, and that's Bourbon County, Kentucky, and Dale will tell you how it got its name and so forth in just a few moments.
Well, if bourbon was the drink of the settlers, how did it become so popular today?
Well, that's a great question, but by this time period now, bourbon is the drink of choice. This is what we have. Remember, we talked about rum starting it all off. The slave triangle goes away, bourbon takes over. By the time we get to the Civil War, it's the drink of choice. Soldiers are carrying flasks of it with them in battle, but understand, this is moonshine. This is not the bourbon we know today. It isn't even oak aged, so we're mixing anything we can in it. The original drink, the John Collins, comes from this time period of putting fruit juice in to soften it up. Jump ahead to the early 1900s. Blended Scotch shows up in the United States. What happens to bourbon? It's not as popular. World War I, the distilleries are not closed, but actually reworked so that that alcohol can be used for munitions. Of course, the distilleries don't reopen in the United States because we have prohibition instead. At that point, we turn to Canada, a thirsty nation looking for alcohol, and we'll talk about Canadian whiskey and how this affects it in the next episode. Jump ahead now to World War II. Again, the distilleries are closed. They were only open for a few years in between, if that, and bourbon never really rebounds. Even though soldiers took it to Europe and it became popular in Europe, they used it for barter, we never really came back. Even though in the 1960s, the U.S. government proclaims that bourbon is the national drink of the United States. In the 1980s, though, single malt Scotch appears. Single batch, single barrel, small batch bourbons are not invented, but are finally marketed. They've been around forever. And just recently, we're starting to see a resurgence of rye whiskey as well.
Well, now for his own look at the history of bourbon, we turn to our master mixologist, Dale Degroff.
I mentioned the Whiskey War of 1793-94, not really a war at all. It was a sort of minor uprising by the distillers of Pennsylvania against the excise men who were sent in by Alexander Hamilton. They burned a few houses down, tarred and feathered a few fellas, and when Washington sent in the army, which he really had to do because this was the first test of the Union, these fellas just pulled up stakes and left town, and they went to the new frontier, Tennessee, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois. By the way, the geography of that area, limestone shelf, lots of indigenous corn, limestone shelf, just like the same limestone shelf that was under the British Islands where they made that good Irish and Scotch whiskey. So these fellas felt right at home there with that limestone water, the indigenous corn. They started making whiskey as a subsistence living. They sold it to the trappers, they sold it to the Indians, and they even floated downstream and sold it to the French in New Orleans. But they couldn't really make a business out of it, at least not until the profound change that happened in the early part of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution stepped in and helped them out. It was that ability to go upstream with a steam engine up to the canal systems of the Northeast and get to that big market of the Northeast that took this little mom and pop business, this subsistence living of making corn whiskey down there in Tennessee and Kentucky, and turned it into big, big business. And along the way, there were a lot of almost accidental innovations. For example, the charred barrel. A lot of people say that Elijah Craig, one of the early bourbon makers, had a bunch of barrels catch on fire, but he reused them anyway, and that's where the charred barrel came from, because it came out a beautiful amber color. I'm not so sure I buy that one. I think I like the one better, where they told the story about how hard it was to get coopered barrels out there in the wilderness. There were no coopers around. And so when the barrels arrived with other products in them, like pickles or fish or oil or whatever, in order to reuse those barrels, they would burn out the insides of them to get the smell out, put their whiskey in, and send them back out again. And they found out 11 or 12 or 18 months later, when the streams rose enough to get their flatboats to float out to the main rivers, after sitting in barrels for 18 months on the way to market, that this whiskey tasted better. This corn whiskey was mellowed. And this corn whiskey we call bourbon started to take over from its rougher customer rye, which was the first colonial whiskey that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson made, totally unaged. They drank it right out of the still. And it was a rough customer. Corn was a sweet grain, rye is a sour grain. Of course, the whiskey's going to taste a little bit different. This was the beginning of a long-standing tradition. As a matter of fact, the word bourbon was first used in print in an advertisement in 1820 in Bourbon County, named after the House of Bourbon. We loved the French in those days because they helped us win the Revolutionary War.
Up next, we'll talk about how bourbon is made.
And our spirit insiders, Morgen and Scott, see what they can find out about American whiskey. That's when Spirit Basics returns. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. Today we're talking about American whiskey, but right now we're going to talk about how it's made.
Well, first of all, let's discuss the ingredients. That's probably where we should go first, as usual. Many times we talk about rye, and we said that some of the early products were definitely made from rye, Western Pennsylvania. Dale mentioned that they started making it from corn. Well, I think he said that that's because that's what grew there well on that limestone shelf. And it always comes back to that, doesn't it? What grows there and what grows best. Now, when it comes to bourbon, we're talking about the type of grain, and it definitely must be corn, but it must be at least 51%, and there are other more specific laws, but the rest can only be wheat or rye. Some of the rules and regulations here, and they're very, very specific, is that it must be made in charred new oak barrels, American oak only, and it has to spend at least 4 years in oak as well. And in order to call it bourbon, all of these things apply. In addition, no color, no flavor, and today they're using continuous distillation.
Now it sounds like there's a lot of rules and regulations that go with bourbon. Do all whiskeys have rules like that?
For the most part, yes. Canadian, Scotch, Irish, they all have rules about the time in oak, the type of oak used, the process that's used, the alcoholic strengths, and so forth. But we're going to cover each one of those in their own separate category later on.
So like tequila, does bourbon have to come from a certain place?
The name Bourbon comes from Bourbon County, and I'm sure the bourbon producers would have you believe that all good bourbon must come from there, but the law says that in order to be called bourbon, it has to follow those rules that we talk about. That's what it's really all about. Quite frankly, there are some other very good American whiskeys. One in particular that you may have heard of by the name of Jack Daniel's comes from very nearby in Tennessee, and even though they don't use the word bourbon and it's made from a different process, it actually follows all the same rules and regulations.
Well, for a deeper look at that process, we turn to our spirit guide.
What separates bourbon and Tennessee whiskeys from every other whiskey on the planet is that with bourbon and Tennessee whiskey, you have to age your whiskey in brand new barrels. And not just brand new, have to be brand new American oak barrels. And that's not enough either. Has to be charred. I mean, literally charred. Like if you ever see somebody make a wine barrel, they'll put a few chips down the bottom, nice little fire in the center there, kind of toasting the insides. Whiskey barrel, whole different story. Let's say this is the top of the barrel, the fire is all the way up here. You're burning the inside of this barrel. Why? Well, it imparts flavor, but I'd also say because traditionally we shipped everything in these barrels. So there could have been fish in that barrel, there could have been tar or nails or clothing or whatever. We need to sterilize that. So you have to do that. That's part and parcel of Tennessee whiskey and a bourbon whiskey. The other issue is how long you leave it in barrel. It's certainly warmer in Kentucky and Tennessee than it is in other places, and I'd admit bourbon's been made in other places outside Kentucky and is still being made, but in most of these places in the Midwest it's warmer, and so these whiskeys age and mature more quickly than they would do in a very cool place like Scotland. In fact, at the top of the warehouse, a lot of these warehouses are 8-9 stories tall, it's pretty warm up there, especially in the summertime. So having a barrel up top, blending it with a barrel down in the bottom, blending it with a barrel in the middle, that tastes different. Interestingly, that tastes different than if you take the barrel and move it around from place to place. Both those things you'll do in bourbon in Tennessee.
Well, now that we've taken a look at the history, the origins, and the process of making bourbon, it's time for an inside look.
Our Spirit Insiders, Morgan and Scott, took a trip to see what they could find out about bourbon. Let's see what they found out.
Thanks, Steve and Jennifer. I'm here in a room full of bourbon barrels with our whiskey expert, Glenn Hopkins. So Glenn, can you tell us a little bit about a bourbon barrel itself and, how long they use them for and where they get them from?
I guess a bourbon barrel, the process for making bourbon is different from the process for making Canadian whiskey. Bourbon can only use new barrels. It has to be at least 51% corn and some other alcohol, whether it's wheat alcohol or potato alcohol or something like that. Most of our barrels come out of Kentucky. They're what we call single-off bourbon barrels, which means they've been used once. We usually get the ones that's been aged for 2 years. It could be 2 years, it could be 4, it could be 10 years, it could be 20-year-old bourbon. Jack Daniels, products like that, Red Label, and so on. Some of that product is 15, 20 years old.
What type of flavors are you looking for when you're using the barrels?
When the barrels are first charred, the charcoal itself is really fresh. So that's why it would actually smooth the product out a lot more. So if you reuse that barrels, you haven't got enough. You don't have as much charcoal, usable charcoal at that stage, that can basically smooth that product out.
Can you not just take the inside of the barrel, maybe give it a little sanding and char it all over again?
Oh, you sure can, but then again, can get rather expensive because you got to get your cooper to take the barrels apart, rechar them, and so on. And not only that, the alcohol actually soaks into the wood. Not only the charcoal itself, but also the wood.
Now, in all warehouses when you're storing your barrels, is it as cold as it is in here?
Yes, it can be, yes. It's Mother Nature takes, like I said, controls the temperature. We don't have any temperature control whatsoever. Bourbon is different. They actually can, when they're storing their barrels, they'll store it on certain levels because when the heat rises and so on, they will actually rotate the barrels up and down.
A very interesting look into the world of bourbon and whiskey. Steve, Jennifer, back to you.
Many people credit James Old Crow as being the father of American whiskey.
Well, up after the break, we continue our look into the spirit world with a lesson on how to drink bourbon and how to use it in some of your favorite cocktails. It's coming up when Spirit Basics returns.
Spirit Basics is brought to you in part by Willow Park Wines and Spirits.
Welcome back to Spirit Basics, the show for everyone who wants to learn more about the world's best cocktails. Now, I've seen a lot of people drink Jack Daniels in a shooter, and I know that that's probably not the most traditional way to do it, but can you tell us some more proper ways to drink?
Well, first of all, we always say there are no rules or regulations when it comes to drinking your favorite spirits, but I will say this, with premium spirits, I always say sip, savor them, don't shoot them, especially when it comes to great whiskeys like these. I mean, why would you? Now, usually, I would say people savor bourbon neat, maybe even in an old-fashioned glass like this. Oftentimes it's served over the rocks. Certainly we drink Daniels and Cola. That's a very popular drink. But in the United States, bourbon is our indigenous spirit, and we do take credit for inventing the cocktail. Consequently, we love to make drinks out of bourbon, whether it be the mint julep or the Manhattan, or as I mentioned, the old-fashioned, the name of this glass, the Collins, the name of that other glass. This is exciting stuff.
Well, for more on how to enjoy these bourbons, we're joined now by our spirit advisor.
Bourbon is it's a very intense drink. It's a powerful drink. And I don't mean bourbon is just powerful in terms of alcohol, although it would do that way as well. I mean, there's a lot of bourbons that are fairly high in alcohol. I mean, it's powerful in its flavor, in the sheer amount, the sheer volume of flavors that's coming at you in a typical glass of bourbon. I can smell cherries, I can smell banana, I can smell some almost like marshmallows, peaches, oranges, I can smell nectarines, I can smell nuts, walnuts, hazelnuts, almonds, things like that. I can smell pepper, black pepper, cloves, cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, all sorts of spices. I can get to something that is definitely like dried fruits. But I can also get to something that's like ash, that's like burnt nuts. It's all sorts of smells, some of which sound fantastic, some of which kind of freak people out a little bit if you haven't had it before. But it's all wrapped up together in a very intense package. And that's what bourbon is supposed to be like. And for better or worse, that's exactly what the best bourbons are like. They have so many flavors you would spend all day trying to describe them. When it comes to Tennessee whiskey, it's virtually made the same way, with one small difference, that you'll go ahead and filter the whiskey once before it goes into barrel through a big vat full of sugar maple charcoal. And that's supposed to soften out some of the congeners and supposed to smooth out some of the edges. Some writers think it actually adds a note of charcoal. For my part, I think it does soften things out a little bit, but bourbon and Tennessee, they're both very intense.
Our master mixologist, King Cocktail Dale Degroff, joins us now with a lesson on how to make a cocktail with bourbon.
Tennessee sour mash whiskey. It's like bourbon, made almost the same way as bourbon, but there's one thing they do to this whiskey that they don't do to bourbon, and that's filter it. So let's try to make a drink with this good Tennessee sour mash whiskey. Corn whiskey, not 100% corn whiskey, but corn whiskey nonetheless. I'm gonna make not the classic mint julep, although mint juleps are great drinks. I find them a little too sweet sometimes. I took the idea of the julep and I wanted to go in a different direction, add something a little bit tart to it. So what I did was, I took a lemon and I cut it up into a couple of chunks and I dropped it in the bottom of my mixing glass. And I added some sugar. I have a sour, I gotta have a sweet. This is sugar water. That's simple syrup I showed you how to make. I need a little bit in there. Now I got these chunks of lemon. I need to mash them up. So I'm gonna take my, by the way, this is not a Yankee souvenir baseball bat. This is my muddler. And I'm gonna mash this real good. Why would I do that? Well, I want the oil in the skin as well as the juice. Now I got my lemon mash. Let's take some mint leaves. And by the way, when you pull a mint sprig out, grab those big leaves on the bottom of the sprig and rip them off and drop them in and leave the pretty top as your garnish. A little flowerette on top. Let me have a couple more big leaves off the bottom. And let's mash those in with my sugar and my lemon. Now we're getting a lot of flavor. Look at that. A lot of mint flavor, a lot of lemon, sugar, and let's take my whiskey. Good shot of whiskey. Now I'm gonna ice my glass up. By the way, when you shake a drink, you never want to use the ice that you shake in the glass that you're going to serve it in. So let's put new ice in here. The ice that you shake with is going to be all melted and worse for the wear, so let's put fresh ice in the serving glass and let's shake our drink up here. So the julep, which was just sugar, water, and mint, now I have something a little more adult tasting. I have sugar, water, lemon, and milk. Now, you know something? If it was a summer day and I had real ripe, sweet peaches, I might drop a couple of peach slices in here and I'd call it a whiskey peach smash instead of the whiskey smash. So how am I going to garnish this? With my beautiful flowerets of mint. Yeah. I'll take another lemon and cut myself a thin wheel. Slide that in there. If I had a peach, I might put a little peach slice in there as the garnish as well. Now you don't want to serve this drink with straws. You want to make them pick it up and put that mint right in their nose. Isn't that lovely? Jennifer, Steve, back to you.
Leave it to Dale to take a classic cocktail and improve on it.
Up after the break, we head into the kitchen with some bourbon recipes. Don't go away. Welcome back to Spirit Basics. As you can see, we're in the kitchen and we're joined by our spirit chef, Chef Allan. Thanks again for joining us.
Great to be here, Jennifer.
Now today we're talking about cooking with bourbon. First off, tell us why we should be cooking with whiskey.
Well, with bourbon especially, it's in musical terms, it's like the country it comes from. It's adding soul. It's really wonderful, deep flavors that you're adding, and as you can even see from the darkness of these compared to other spirits that we've cooked with, now we're getting into some really interesting flavors.
So what does a bourbon whiskey add that maybe a Scotch whiskey doesn't?
Well, actually, interestingly, more subtlety. So with Scotches, you might get peat or smoky flavors, and with some of these bourbons, you're going to get some smoky flavors, but you also get some interesting sweeter flavors like caramel or savory flavors like vanilla. And so, again, it really is a bit more complex, and that's why they're so good to have at hand when you're cooking with things.
Okay, well, we have two recipes in front of us here. Can you tell us what they are?
Well, they're both bourbon recipes. The ribs are dynamite bourbon ribs, and what we have as well is Kentucky bourbon sweet potatoes.
You can actually smell the sweetness coming off the plate.
And that's interesting. What we in both of these dishes, what we're looking for is cooking and using the sugars. So we're doing a little bit of chemistry in this episode because you can see how beautifully caramelized these are, and the bourbon really goes well with that sugary taste. Again, when you're talking about things like vanilla and caramely taste, the sugar is perfect with it.
So would you be marinating these ribs in the bourbon?
Absolutely. In fact, what you want to do with this recipe is you want to make a marinade and marinate these for at least 24 hours if you can. And the reason is because between the marination process and the slow cooking, what you're going to do is break down the collagens or the fat in the ribs, and you're going to get them coated with this beautiful caramel on the outside. And that's why when you open up these things, they just fall off the bone.
You're making me so hungry here. What are some of the other things that you like to make using bourbon? Well,
like the sweet potatoes, I actually like to use them with things like pears. I have some Jack Daniels with brushed with little pears on the barbecue. It's fantastic. And in addition to these sweet potatoes, you could use other things like squash, something that has a higher sugar content, or even turnips would be really, really good with this recipe.
Well, let's get into those ribs right now.
All right.
If you'd like to try these at home, all you have to do is log on to our website for the recipe. Over to you now, Stephen.
Thanks for those great recipes, Jennifer. You know, in the States, it's quite traditional to not only cook with bourbon, but to serve it at your backyard barbecue. But that's it for this edition of Spirit Basics. Make sure and join us next week when we take a closer look at rye and Canadian whiskey. I'm Stephen Olson, and for Jennifer Allan and our entire team here at Spirit Basics, we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Special thanks to Willow Park Wine and Spirits, whose dedication to providing knowledge, awareness, and service to their customers has made this show possible.